I compiled this video last night featuring the deadliest real-life shark attacks that I've covered on the channel thus far. These stories include some of the most notorious, as well as some lesser-known attacks that have occurred in Australia, as well as South Africa, countries whose waters are known for a high number of shark sightings and attacks, especially great whites. The special also includes a video that covers the infamous New Jersey Beach shark attacks of 1916. These are the world's deadliest shark attacks.
We've covered many different kinds of animal attack stories on the channel thus far, but this one in particular is definitely a real-life horror story. Just imagining the horrific ordeal that these three people had to go through was enough to send shudders down my spine, and is likely to terrify even the most resilient of us. This is the true story behind the 2010 movie, The Reef, and it features one of the most horrifying shark attacks ever recorded. In 1983, 27-year-old Ray Boundy had been living the life he always wanted in the beautiful tropical city of Townsville in northeastern Australia. The father of two was captain of the New Venture, a 45-foot-long prawn trawler boat, and was also, by all accounts, a highly accomplished seaman, despite his age. On Friday, July 22nd, Ray and his crew make some final preparations for a shrimp fishing trip. Later that evening, the crew boards the New Venture and sets off on their journey. On board with Ray is second captain Dennis Murphy, who was a 23-year-old deckhand from Brisbane who, like Ray, had lots of experience at sea despite his young age. The third and final member of the crew was Ray's girlfriend, 21-year-old Linda Horton, whose primary role was to cook for herself and the crew. The crew was headed for a specific region of the water between Townsville and the Great Barrier Reef. The waters in this region were considered great fishing grounds, so the crew had intentions of staying in this area for a few weeks, a time in which they typically work odd jobs and relax during the days, and then cast their nets in the evening and fish throughout the night. The trio enjoyed each other's company and were undoubtedly lovers of the sea. And so the first 2 days of the trip consisted of laughter, relaxation, and enjoyment as the New Venture headed toward the fishing grounds. It's now the night of July 22nd, and in stark contrast to the first 2 days of smooth sailing, the New Venture is suddenly hit with high winds accompanied with extremely rough seas. The crew assessed the situation and figured that their only option would be to ride out the conditions and hope for the best. As midnight struck, the conditions were not getting any better, and the boat was being hit by massive waves causing internal flooding. As Ray and Lindy are in the wheelhouse doing everything they can to keep the New Venture afloat, Dennis, meanwhile, who was out on the deck, suddenly notices a gigantic wave rapidly approaching the boat. With no time to warn the others, Dennis instinctively jumps off the boat as it's simultaneously hit by the colossal wave, which instantly capsizes and flips the New Venture. Meanwhile, Ray and Lindy, who are of course blindsided by the wave, are trapped in the wheelhouse. Using a small pocket of air to gather themselves, the two quickly plan an escape route, dive down, and manage to swim out of the surface through the wheelhouse entrance. Spotting Dennis shortly after they surfaced, the three then group together in the water, and the reality of their situation begins to sink in. The trio now find themselves treading open water at night near their capsized boat with no land in sight. As they pull themselves onto the overturned hull of the boat and out of the water, the trio then begin assessing their survival options. A few hours go by, and it's now Monday morning. Ray informs Lindy and Dennis that based on the coordinates he'd taken down prior to the boat capsizing, the crew were approximately 95 kilometers from Townsville and 45 kilometers from the closest group of islands. Understanding that swimming such a distance would be nearly impossible given their current situation, the trio realized that their best chance of survival would be to swim to the Great Barrier Reef, which was the only other way they were getting out of the water. It's also worth noting that the crew likely assumed that swimming to the reef rather than staying on the boat's hull would be a safer bet, as they likely believed the boat would sink before they could be rescued, or even drift so far off course and out to sea that their chances of survival would be that much slimmer as a result. The trio thereafter collects some items from the shipwreck and assemble a small, makeshift life raft out of them. Using some rope, they tie together a surfboard, a life ring, some styrofoam boxes, and a beer cooler. And finally, the trio enter the coral sea waters and begin paddling towards the reef on their makeshift life raft. With no drinking water or protection from the scorching sun, the trio risked dehydration and nasty sunburn as immediate physical threats. In the back of their minds, however, and with good reason, was the fact that they were swimming in open sea, in waters that were once again considered prime fishing ground, which also meant that encounters with curious sharks were also a very real, and not to mention highly dangerous, possibility. Despite the potential threats they faced, the trio remained optimistic about their chances of survival, and so were making good progress as they paddled towards the reefs. It's now Monday night. The trio is about a quarter way to the reefs at this point, and everything seems to be going smoothly, when all of a sudden, the trio come to an immediate halt when they notice a huge fin break the water's surface not far away from them. Being no stranger to ocean wildlife, Ray quickly warns the others that the fin belonged to a shark. As Dennis and Lindy's panic levels rise, Captain Ray then reassures them that shark attacks are rare and that the shark was most likely just curious, and that if they did nothing to provoke it, it would most probably leave them alone, which is often the case when it comes to encounters with curious wild sharks. At this point, the trio had been swimming for hours, and the rough ocean water had caused their makeshift raft to separate, and so each of them were now paddling on their own item. As they paddled for a few meters, Ray suddenly feels the enormous shark pass underneath him, and before he could react, the 15-foot tiger shark quickly turns and bites him on his knee, at which point Ray kicks the shark so quickly that it in fact stopped the shark mid-bite and caused it to swim off. The trio are now frozen in fear, realizing that now that it's tasted blood, this tiger shark was likely coming back for what it thinks is a potential meal. Second to only the mighty great white shark, tiger sharks are known as one of the largest predatory sharks in the world. Reaching lengths of over 16 feet, weighing over 2,000 pounds, these sharks are no doubt a force to be reckoned with. Most sharks have an upper jaw that is built to pierce through the flesh of prey, and a lower jaw designed to grip and hold the kill in place. Unlike most sharks, however, all of a tiger shark's 24 upper and lower teeth are identical in both the upper and lower jaws. This allows the sharks to cut and grip onto prey using both jaws, providing double the cutting and sawing capacity that most sharks are capable of. This in turn results in some of the most gruesome shark bites on record. Ray, Lindy, and Dennis continue to swim towards the reef. Panic begins to set in. Every time they'd hear a splashing sound, they'd quickly turn their heads, thinking it's a shark. And each time this happened, they'd realize more and more just how helpless they'd be if it returned for them. What made matters even more frightening was the fact that it was the dead of night and visibility was scarce, which made spotting the shark by looking beneath them as they would be able to in the daytime nearly impossible. Approximately 10 more minutes go by. A large dorsal fin once again breaks the water for a split second and then quickly disappears. The trio stop in their tracks, frozen in silence, and suddenly, Dennis screams in agony. "It's got my leg! The bastard's got my leg!" Ray immediately shouts towards Dennis to kick the shark as hard as he could, hoping it would take off as it did in the prior encounter. But to his misfortune, the tiger had launched a predatory attack on Dennis rather than the exploratory one on Ray, and so Dennis's kicks had little to no effect. At this point, Lindy and Ray helplessly watch in horror as Dennis's body gets pulled under the water. A few moments pass, and Dennis abruptly resurfaces. Lindy and Ray instantly notice the dark water around him quickly begin turning even darker, which indicated of course that he was rapidly losing massive amounts of blood. Ray quickly swims over to Dennis's body in an attempt to rescue him, only to realize that his leg was missing. Ray and Lindy instantly begin to panic even more at this point, and begin frantically searching for something to make a tourniquet with. And it was as they were searching for this material that the massive tiger shark reappears. It was at this time that Dennis realizes that he was not going to survive this ordeal, and shouts to Ray and Lindy to gather their stuff, leave him, and bolt. Before the couple could even react, Dennis then pushes them away and begins swimming the opposite direction, drawing the shark away from them. Ray and Lindy reluctantly begin paddling towards the reef again, realizing there's nothing they can do to save their friend. And as they turn around, they see Dennis's body get lifted out of the water by the shark, who then pulls him under for a final time. At this point, Lindy simply couldn't process what she just witnessed, and so begins screaming uncontrollably. Ray grabs a hold of Lindy by the shoulders and shakes her back to her senses, reminding her that they need to stay calm and get to the reef, or Dennis's sacrifice would have been all for nothing. Lindy then takes a few deep breaths and finally calms down as Ray explains to her that they'd be at the reef by morning if they sustained the pace that they were paddling. And so the pair now begins their final paddle towards the reef. 2 whole hours go by, and Lindy and Ray seemed to be making excellent progress. Everything seemed just fine. It was at this point that a large fin once again breaks the surface of the water, and this time, it begins slowly circling Ray and Lindy. The pair stop and watch helplessly as the shark circles them, holding hands tight and frozen in terror once again, praying that the shark goes away. A few moments go by, when all of a sudden, the shark breaks off from its circle and begins swimming toward Lindy. Half of the shark's head then protrudes out of the water near Lindy as it swiftly bit into her chest and her arms and began tugging so hard that it pulled her hand out of Ray's grip as he attempted to hold on to his girlfriend. A few moments later, and Lindy lets out a tiny squeal, and it was at this point that the shark then begins viciously shaking its head from side to side while latched on to her torso. Lindy goes completely silent. At this point, Ray quickly turns around and starts swimming as fast as he could to Lodestone Reef, which he knew he was very close to. As Tuesday morning arrives, Ray has almost reached the reef. As he got to about a few hundred meters from it, however, to his shock and horror, the shark once again resurfaces behind him. Since Ray could clearly see the reef at this point, this in turn gives him a sudden boost of adrenaline, and he begins swimming as fast as he could towards the reef, despite knowing the tiger shark would be right behind him. And as if it were divine intervention, Ray notices a big wave approaching, and manages to catch this wave, which ultimately gave him the momentum he needed to get to safety and away from the shark. As he barely pulls himself onto the reef, the exhausted and severely traumatized 27-year-old then lets his emotions go, realizing the gravity of his experience. At 10:40 on Tuesday morning, Ray was finally found by an Australian Air Force rescue copter that had been searching for the trio since the storm had picked up on Sunday. Despite captaining a new boat and continuing life as a fisherman, the psychological trauma of those 36 hours is something that Ray doesn't believe he will ever get over.
The following video depicts one of the most harrowing shark attacks on record. It occurred in South Africa in the year 2004 when a 77-year-old teacher was brutally attacked and consumed by a massive great white in front of multiple eyewitnesses. This is the horrifying true story of Tina Webb's fatal encounter with one of our ocean's most feared predators. Today's episode takes us to False Bay of Fishhook Beach, located in the Western Cape province of South Africa. This stunning location boasts crystal clear blue waters and a picturesque stretch of white sand beaches. Surrounded by awe-inspiring mountains, the beach is known as a hotspot for swimmers, sunbathers, and water sports enthusiasts. And as a coastal suburb of Cape Town, Fishhook is also often frequented by commuters, retirees, and vacationers alike. However, the undeniable beauty of the South African coastline is sometimes referred to by some as a facade, a beauty that conceals the potential danger posed by its marine inhabitants. The waters in this particular area are known to be home to several dangerous sea creatures, the most notable of which is the great white shark, sightings of which are known to be quite common in these waters. This list also includes bull sharks, tiger sharks, and bronze whaler sharks. And since it's well known that their common prey items such as Cape fur seals are highly prevalent in these waters, it's no wonder that Fishhook Beach is plagued by an average of 7 great white shark attacks on humans per year, 10% of which result in death. It's November 13th of 2004, and a group of local fishermen are returning to Kalk Bay with a large catch after a day of fishing. Among their haul are various types of fish, including a large school of steenbras. The school of these powerful fish are so violent that their thrashing makes the surface water appear to be boiling. As per Kalk Bay fishing protocols, steenbras are a protected species and must be released immediately if accidentally caught. The fishermen, however, are unaware that they've caught a large school of them in their nets. Additionally, the water is filled with a heavy pool of fish blood due to all the recent fishing activity. As the group navigates the treacherous waters of the ocean for nearly 1.5 kilometers, they would eventually pull their nets from the water and discover that they've unknowingly hauled some illegal fish. Well aware of the fishing protocols, the experienced fishermen decide to take a break and release them back into the bay. Little do they know, however, that an extremely massive great white has been drawn by the scent of their bountiful catch, and it was stalking them from just meters away. As they work to free the Steenbras, everything seems to be going smoothly when suddenly, the group notices a massive fin break the surface of the water next to their boat. According to an article by sharktrust.org, almost 2/3 of a shark's brain is dedicated to the sense of smell alone. In fact, sharks are able to detect even a teaspoon of blood in an average of 375,000 liters of water. This also means that an open pool of fish blood in the waters near a shark's territory is nothing but a clear invitation for a feast. According to the group, this shark was the biggest that they had ever laid their eyes on, and this was confirmed by each and every one of them. They estimated that she was around 20 feet in length or even more, and typically, a shark of that size wouldn't be interested in such small fish, and the men knew that she would much prefer to chow down on a larger marine mammal, such as the aforementioned plethora of Cape fur seals that the bay hosted. The men continue to observe as the shark circles their boat with her eyes locked on the trapped school of fish, but she surprisingly doesn't attack, and after circling the boat a few more times, the massive white abruptly turns and, to the horror of the men, begins heading straight towards Fishhook Beach on what was a busy day in the waters. It's 7 in the morning and Fishhook Bay has just opened again after 2 days of mandatory closure. Tina Webb, a 77-year-old retired English teacher, sets out for her regular morning swim, a routine she has maintained for the past 17 years. Tina, who loved to stay fit, would swim at the bay routinely at least 6 times a week, dedicating 30 to 45 minutes to each session. On this particular day, however, little does she know that she has slipped into her swimsuit and donned her favorite red cap for what would be the final time. As she dives into the water and swims out against the shore for about 60 yards, Tina smoothly strokes her way along the surface of the crystal clear blue waters and begins making her usual laps parallel to the beach line. The weather is calm, with a gentle wind blowing from south to southeast, which in turn creates no whitecaps to mask the sound of her splashing arms and leg. A strong attractant, of course, for curious sharks, who are also very capable of sensing small vibrations in the water, a technique they often use to locate wounded fish at the surface. Although there were about 30 to 40 people at the shore during the time, only 2 people, including Tina, are in the water. As she continues to swim, a giant fin suddenly breaks the surface approximately 25 yards away from her. And just as an oblivious Tina transitions from a backstroke to a breaststroke, she unintentionally, of course, places herself directly in front of the shark. And in an instant, she freezes in horror as she finds herself looking into the beady eyes and gray head of an incredibly massive great white, at which point it violently breaks out of the water in front of her, causing a spike of adrenaline to surge through her veins. Tina attempts to desperately swim away from the shark to the best of her ability, but of course there was no way she was outswimming a shark, especially one this massive and powerful. And before she could let out another scream, the massive white then lunges at her with a speed of approximately 100 yards a minute and rams her in the midsection, delivering a devastating bite to her abdomen. The shark then releases her from its formidable jaws, and stunned witnesses from the beach watch in horror as the water around Tina turns blood red. And within seconds, the shark then once again reappears and bites her again around the same area of her torso, causing her gut to pierce open as her intestines then spilled out of them in what looked like a scene straight out of a horror movie. The great white would then make a quick spin around Tina's limp body and come back at her from her other side. And with a ferocious final strike, the great white then latches Tina's fragile 77-year-old frame between its jaws and begins to shake her back and forth violently, a technique they often use to rip chunks of flesh and fat off of their prey. Although she'd likely succumb to her wounds at this point, the witnesses from the beach would report that the shark would release Tina once again and proceed to swim in circles around her about 3 times before finally seizing her one last time, at which point it would pull her below the surface, never to be seen again. The eyewitnesses, paralyzed by fear and horror, could do nothing but watch the shark's dorsal fin slice through the waves one last time before it finally disappeared into the depths, leaving behind a pall of dread that would linger long after her departure. 2 rescue boats from the National Sea Rescue Institute and a patrol craft from the South African Navy were dispatched to search for Tina's remains, and a red SkyMed helicopter was also sent to the scene. After several hours of searching the waters around the scene of the attack, the officer in the copter would eventually spot the shark in the area of Clovelly near Fish Hook. He reported, just like others before him, that this great white was at least 20 feet in length and was even larger than the chopper he was flying. Despite a valiant effort by search and rescue teams, no trace of Tina, except for her red swimming cap, which had been floating near the scene of the initial attack, would be found. A photographer had unintentionally captured an image of Tina just a few days before her passing, while trying to photograph the Fish Hook Bay landscape. Upon seeing this picture, her family and friends would mention that even though she was gone, this picture served as a perfect memory of her, one that would help them relive the good times when she'd return home from her daily swim, wearing her white bathrobe and her favorite red swim cap.
New Jersey shore, 1916. A massive heat wave strikes the entire East Coast, causing temperatures to soar to record numbers, attracting thousands of people to the cool Atlantic breezes. It was a time when ocean swimming had just started becoming popular, and there was, by most accounts, no better place to be. Considered a part of the Philadelphia elite, renowned nose and throat specialist Dr. Eugene LaRue Vance and his family arrive at Beach Haven's English Side Hotel for a weekend getaway. At 5 p.m. on July 1st, Dr. Van Sant, his eldest son, 22-year-old aspiring businessman Charles Van Sant, and his younger sister Louise are enjoying the day at the beach. As his dad wrapped things up for the day, Charles figures he has just enough time for a swim before a 6 o'clock dinner with the family. Along with a dog he'd befriended on the beach, the pair enters the beautiful 68-degree Fahrenheit waters and begins swimming towards the horizon. As she tried to keep up with Charles, the dog abruptly stops as she senses something lurking in the depths, and thereby turns around and begins rapidly paddling back to shore. Meanwhile, back on shore, lifeguard Alexander Watts is having a casual conversation with Louise, and everything seemed totally normal, when suddenly, instantly recognizing that this was a shark attack, the Olympic-level swimmer plunges into the water after him. Just seconds later, local resident John Everton follows suit. In less than 3 feet of water, a massive tug-of-war would ensue. The shark would loosen its grip on Charles, allowing Watts and Everton to pull him to shore. As people in the beach looked on, it became apparent that they were just as confused about what they were witnessing as they were horrified. And could one really blame them? The public was, after all, assured by experts over at the American Museum of Natural History that sharks were nothing to worry about. At about 1:45 in the afternoon at Spring Lake, 27-year-old Swiss Bell captain of the Essex and Sussex Hotel, Charles Bruder, an avid and extremely strong swimmer, is out on his daily swim. On the beach and enjoying a typical summer day in these parts, lifeguard George White has his eyes on a girl as she makes gestures to him to get in the water with her. A massive shark emerges from the ocean depths and makes its way toward Bruder. The girl with lifeguard White screams as she sees what she thinks is the bottom hull of a capsized red canoe. Moments later, White and fellow lifeguard Chris Anderson hurriedly launched their boat, knowing just how precious time was given the amount of blood in the water, not to mention Bruder was at about a quarter-mile distance from them. As the men paddle to within approximately 50 yards of Bruder, they freeze in horror for a split second as the distraught 27-year-old yells, "It bit me. It bit my legs off." As they pulled Bruder onto the boat, the lifeguards were shocked to feel just how light his body was, as both his legs were bitten off, one just above the knee and the other just below. Experienced fisherman Thomas Cottrell was quite knowledgeable about sharks. On his way to his fishing spot, Thomas stops at a wooden bridge over a small tidal creek. The retired sea captain casually glances down from the bridge into the tidal river below, and instantly freezes in shock as he notices a massive shark swimming along the surface. The tidal river, known as Matawan Creek, was approximately 1.5 miles from open seawater, and was known as a popular spot for catfish and mud turtles. But sharks? A shark was the last thing that Cottrell expected to see in these waters. A confused and concerned Cottrell then rushes into town, and frantically starts informing everyone he sees about him having seen a shark in the river. Despite his sincerest efforts, however, sadly the townspeople would not believe him and instead dismissed him as a prankster or suggested that his eyes likely deceived him. As a frustrated Cottrell desperately pleads the legitimacy of his discovery to the people of Matawan, 5 young boys excitedly get ready for their favorite summertime activity, an afternoon swim in Matawan Creek, which was located about a mile from the ridge. One of the boys is 11-year-old Lester Stillwell. The boys are having a blast in the river, splashing water at each other, play fighting, and having mini races, or in other words, doing what kids their age do best. Suddenly, and out of nowhere, Lester lets out a piercing scream. The helpless 11-year-old is being attacked by a massive shark, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. The other 4 boys rush out of the water naked, looking back in horror as they were running, as the water around Lester is consumed by blood. The traumatized boys reach town and alert 23-year-old Stanley Fisher of the incident. The popular, athletic, and natural-born leader was someone that they frequently played sandlot baseball with, and were a few of many who looked up to him as a role model. Doubtful of the boy's shark story, Fisher gathers a few men despite this and makes his way to Matawan Creek. Assuming the boy had suffered from an epileptic seizure and most likely drowned, Fisher rushes out of his clothes and dives into the water in an attempt to recover Lester's body. He searches the bottom of the lake and then a few seconds later resurfaces. Despite multiple attempts, there was still no sign of Lester. The devastated people standing along the riverbanks begin showing clear signs that they were losing hope, at which point the courageous Fisher decides to have one more go at it, and so dives one more time to the very bottom of the river, and to everyone's relief, resurfaces with Lester's limp body in his arms. Fisher then successfully pulls Lester's body to the riverbank and out of the water. Just as he was about to get out of the water, the shark suddenly reappears once again and latches onto his torso by his hip and thigh. Fisher's men then start beating the shark with large sticks in an attempt to fend it off, but the damage had already been done. Fisher's right leg had been stripped of its flesh from hip to knee, exposing his innards. When rescuers arrive at the scene, they quickly wrap tourniquets around Fisher's leg, the first of which fails to hold and breaks, whereas the second one manages to hold, yet inevitably fails to stop the immense bleeding. Knowing the nearest hospital was nearly 10 miles away from Matawan, and due to bad roads, the rescuers improvise a stretcher out of some planks and rush Fisher to the train station. Despite successfully getting Fisher to the hospital, doctors would later conclude that there was no saving him, primarily due to major blood loss, as well as a result of the severe shock that he experienced. The heroic 23-year-old's death would mark an unprecedented 4th fatal shark attack over the span of just 12 days. As local authorities struggled to find the culprit shark over at Matawan Creek, brothers Joseph and Michael Dunn, along with their friend Jerry Horrifying, excitedly plunge into the river for a late afternoon dip, unaware of course of the recent attacks. After playing in the water for some time, Michael and Jerry pull themselves onto the dock, and just as his brother Joseph was about to make it to safety, Michael Dunn looks on in horror as the massive shark protrudes half its body out of the water and bites and latches on to his younger brother's leg. Michael snaps out of his frozen state and jumps back into the water after his brother in a desperate attempt to fend the shark off. A nearby fisherman is alerted by the commotion and joins in the rescue. Unfortunately, the shark managed to tear open Joseph's leg from knee to ankle before finally fleeing into the river depths. Fortunately, and to the relief of his loved ones, Joseph would survive. Aforementioned director of the Museum of Natural History releases a public statement admitting that his perception of sharks given the recent attacks have changed. He stated that he now believes that sharks are sometimes man-killers. 11-year-old Lester Stillman's body was later recovered from the river. Parts of his torso, left shoulder, abdomen, and thigh were consumed by the shark. His left foot and ankle were also torn off. These gruesome details eventually led investigators to believe that the shark likely returned to feed on Lester's carcass multiple times, after ending his life in what was undeniably shocking and immeasurably painful fashion. circus animal trainer Michael Schleicher and esteemed taxidermist and former big game hunter John Murphy set out for a day of fishing in Raritan Bay, just off the mouth of Matawan Creek. The men cast their nets with hopes of scoring baitfish. As they conversed and enjoyed the beautiful weather and cool ocean breeze, a 7-foot great white shark suddenly gets trapped in the fishing net. As it violently thrashes its body back and forth in an attempt to free itself, the force of the young and powerful great white causes the boat to aggressively rock back and forth in the water. With no guns or harpoons, the men then resort to their only means of doing any sort of damage, using a broken oar to hit the shark as hard as they could, as much as they could, and wherever they could. The shark would later die in the net. Michael Schleicher and John Murphy were then labeled heroes by the townspeople for slaying what many believed to be the man-eater responsible for the recent attacks. The investigators based their conclusions in a pattern they'd identified in the location of the attacks. The first attack on Charles Van Sant at Beach Haven precluded the attack on Bruder, which had occurred 40 miles north at Spring Lake. The attacks on Fisher and Stillman happened a further 30 miles north at Matawan Creek, and the shark caught by Schleicher and Murphy was also caught another very similar 40 miles north of Matawan Creek. These 4 shocking and most certainly tragic shark-related fatalities would go on to put the entire world on notice about sharks. Not only did the infamous Jersey Beach shark attacks devastate millions across the nation, but they also marked the birth of a collective global psyche shared by the majority of humans of then and now, one that stems from the worldwide fear of sharks, much of which is without a doubt fabricated and/or blown out of proportion. What if I told you it was possible to fall in love with one of the most feared creatures on the planet? Well, in this video, I will tell you of a man whose story undoubtedly serves as a real-life example in support of just how possible this is. This is the terrifying tale of the legendary Rodney Fox, who on one fateful day during a spearfishing competition would fall victim to a gruesome great white shark attack in Australian waters that would go down in history as the most famous shark attack survival story ever reported. Born in Adelaide, Australia in 1948, Rodney Fox had been determined to make his mark beyond the comforts of his hometown and see what the world had to offer. Taking every opportunity presented to him to explore further and further away from home as he was growing up, Rodney would throw himself into a variety of outdoor activities such as fishing, hunting, and diving. Little did he know, however, that these favorite pastimes of his would mark the beginnings of an illustrious career at sea, paving the path that would one day lead him to becoming world-renowned for major contributions to the study of ocean wildlife. Taking advantage of practically living on the beaches of Australia, Rodney would take to spearfishing in his teenage years, displaying an impressive aptitude for not just finding great catches in rapid fashion, but also displaying a unique ability that pro spearfishermen would call reading the water. Rodney's favorite hobbies would soon be complemented by his physical prowess, as he'd in his prime develop elite agility, strength, and balance, attributes which allowed him to masterfully launch himself onto a surfboard while dodging incoming waves, all while simultaneously hunting out large catches. It's December 8th of 1963, and the annual South Australian Spearfishing Championships are about to begin. Rodney, who was now 23 and already a former champion at this point, takes to the water in search of a large reef fish. As he scans the water for movement, little does he know that a large great white shark lurks just a few meters away. And worst of all, it's stalking him. It's important to note that as per a recent article, I'll leave the link in the description for you, published by Statista.com, surfers and board sports enthusiasts account for 51% of all shark attacks in the past year, while swimmers and waders accounted for 39%. Body surfing or horseplay, they come in at 6%, with snorkeling and freediving at 4%. The Florida Museum explains that the percentages of these dangerous shark encounters have risen over the past few years, and this mainly comes down to the high and still rising number of people that are engaging in activities that encroach on their territories. Just something to keep in mind before venturing into the waters that these prehistoric ocean predators inhabit. After hours of continuous diving and hauling his catches to shore for weighing, Rodney's informed that he had to catch a big dusky morwong if he were to have any chance of catching up with the competition leader. The former defending champ, undaunted by fatigue, thereby pushes himself onward and swims out to an area where few other competitors dare to venture, beyond the reef into the depths reaching 25 yards. After hours of anticipation, Rodney finally spots one large morwong hanging among some rocks, which hadn't yet noticed his presence, at which point he cautiously stalks forward as he slowly began applying pressure to the trigger. He has a perfect shot. Rodney is struck with such brute force that at first he thought he'd been hit by a submarine. He snaps out of his frozen state moments later, only to realize that he was latched between the jaws of an enormous great white shark. Helplessly watching ocean water roar by him faster than he'd ever imagined it could, and knowing any hesitation could prove fatal at this point, a determined Rodney, fueled by his adrenaline-filled muscles, successfully manages to gouge his finger into one of the shark's eyes, causing it to release him from its mighty grip, at which point Rodney makes a life-altering decision. Just as the shark released him, Rodney tries to use one of his arms to push the shark away from him, but to his shock and horror, instead watches his arm disappear into the shark's mouth, as it forcefully bit down on it. In a desperate attempt to jerk his arm out of the shark's mouth, its jagged teeth saw into its flesh, bones, and tendons, rendering it useless, at which point the shark swims off, leaving an understandably traumatized Rodney frozen in shock once again, except now immersed in a pool of his own blood. Upon snapping back to his senses, Rodney then retrieves his mask and spear gun, and thereby begins desperately swimming towards the surface as fast as he could, when suddenly, once again, the persistent great white attacks. Engaged in yet another life-or-death struggle, Rodney then attempts to wrap his arms and legs around the middle of the shark's massive torso in an attempt to keep it from biting him. Realizing that this particular white's massive girth made it nearly impossible for him to secure a grip on its body, Rodney then manages to kick his way to the surface, emerging out of the water a few seconds later with huge gasps for air, at the same time noticing the water around him turn more and more blood red by the second. And like something out of a horror movie, the great white's massive gray head and beady eyes rise out of the bloody water near him, at which point Rodney attempts to kick the shark, but misses. To his good fortune, at least for now, his reaction would be enough to cause the hungry shark to turn its attention to his buoy full of fish, swallowing it whole instantly. As the shark turned downwards and begins swimming away towards the ocean depths, a horrifying realization strikes Rodney. He suddenly recalls that his buoy had been tethered to his lead weight. And so, while gathering all the energy and courage within him, Rodney takes a huge, deep breath, knowing what would come next. And with a vicious tug, he's once again hurled through the water, except this time, the great white is rapidly pulling him into deeper waters. Rodney grasps desperately around his weight belt, searching for the quick release, at which point his consciousness begins fading, and everything starts getting fuzzy. And so, realizing that he's fighting a losing battle, Rodney at this point nearly begins to accept defeat, when once more, to his good fortune, the rope had been partially cut during the attack and weakened just enough for it to snap, enabling him once more to swim to the surface. Just moments later, some nearby fishermen noticed some disturbance in the water, followed by a growing pool of blood, and it was at this point that Rodney resurfaces. And as if his ordeal couldn't get any more horrifying, Rodney's stomach and intestines would then spill out from his gut onto the boat floor as soon as the men would pull him on board. Miraculously, Rodney would survive this horrific ordeal, despite serious injuries including punctures across his chest, blood-filled lungs, and a severed arm. He would receive over 500 stitches to repair the damage caused by the multiple lacerations he'd received throughout his body. In an unusual twist, and despite having survived an experience so traumatizing that it would have most people shuddering at even the thought of a shark, Rodney would on the contrary redefine his experience as one that he could use as an opportunity to not just learn more about these ancient creatures, but also preserve their existence in our oceans. Rodney Fox would go on to revolutionize the entire field of marine exploration by designing the very first shark cage for underwater viewing, allowing humans to have an unprecedented, up-close and personal experience with even the deadliest of them.
If you are new to the channel and do happen to gain something out of this content, smash that like and subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on that notification bell so that you can be one of the first to know when a new episode has been released. The following story is known as one of the most brutal shark attacks in recorded history. This terrifying attack took place just off the coast at Wiseman's Beach near Port Lincoln in Peak Bay, South Australia. With its tranquil landscape comprising of bushlands, awe-inspiring coastal cliffs, and pockets of secluded white sand beaches, it's no wonder that the port is known as one of Australia's prime tourist hotspots for adventure seekers and vacationers alike. Wiseman's Beach, on the other hand, is a much more remote spot similar to a large lagoon, and is also a prime fishing location for those with a preference for a quieter, more remote experience at the bay. To further add to its marvel, the coastal region's ecosystem teems with a variety of unique wildlife, ranging from marsupials such as gray kangaroos, to reptiles like tiger snakes and blue-tongued lizards on land, to the magnificent parrots and seabirds which inhabit its skies. The coast furthermore features a variety of aquatic creatures, ranging from marine mammals such as sea lions and fur seals, to some of the most dangerous animals on the planet. A list that includes the visually captivating, yet notoriously deadly box jellyfish, and of course, the breathtaking but globally feared great white shark. Famous for the once-in-a-lifetime experience which it offers thrill seekers of cage diving with great white sharks, these waters have been confirmed to host one of the largest populations of these magnificent and ancient apex predators. Despite the potential risks and dangers they may pose to humans in a close encounter, the fact of the matter was, and still remains, that shark attacks were extremely rare occurrences at Peak Bay. And when it comes to shark attacks on humans, when you look at it from a worldwide annual statistical basis, there are on average only 70 recorded shark attacks on humans per year, and only a fraction of these result in loss of life. And given the fact that there are so far 480 known species of sharks consisting of a mostly healthy population, this is actually a relatively small number of incidents. In fact, since the year that this attack took place, a shark attack hadn't resulted in a human fatality in these waters for 9 straight years. When in January of 1974, 26-year-old Terry Manuel was killed and eaten by a great white that viciously attacked him during his ascent from an abalone dive. Having recently migrated from a rural Australian town known as Carcoo, Shirley Ann Durden, her husband Barry, and their 4 children decided to move to Wiseman's Beach due to Barry's severe allergies to farm life. The move was furthermore a no-brainer for the couple, as they, like many other people, had considered living by the beach to be one of their long-time dreams. On March 3rd of 1985, the family had decided to hit the beach for the afternoon with a good friend of Shirley and Barry's, Keith Coventry. As they situated themselves on the beach, the trio of adults spontaneously decided that they would go snorkeling for some scallops. After ensuring the kids were settled down at the beach, Shirley and Barry informed the kids that they won't be too long, nor will they be too far offshore. The children, who were already far too engaged in their beach games, nonchalantly respond with quick and attentive nods and rush goodbyes, unaware, of course, of the horrors soon to come. After collecting their scallops, Barry and Keith head to shore and patiently wait for Shirley to finish scanning the sea bottom. The two men get lost in conversation and joke with one another and the kids, bragging about who managed to collect more scallops than the other. Meanwhile, Shirley is still snorkeling, mesmerized by the sights and overall experience that the bay offered. Suddenly, as if one were snapping out of a trance, Shirley realizes she's collected way more scallops than she'd originally intended to, which is when she began to slowly turn her body and head back to shore toward the family. An approximately 22-foot and highly famished great white shark emerges out of the depths of the deep blue sea. It begins scanning for movements with its jet black eyes and remarkable hearing ability, which allows it to sense low-frequency vibrations in the water, such as that of a wounded fish, which upon detection would instantly set off its curiosity to its maximum capacity given the animal's level of hunger. It's important to note that there are two kinds of shark attacks. In other words, there are two primary ways that shark attacks are categorized. The first kind is a provoked attack. And yes, there have been several documented instances where humans have provoked sharks and been unsurprisingly attacked as a result. And then there's the second kind, which are known as unprovoked attacks. In this circumstance, the shark attacks a human out of curiosity or, in rarer cases, with the intention to consume. The great white continues to swim in Shirley's direction as it desperately scans the water for movement, and as it got closer and closer, it finally spots a figure splashing and swimming near the surface. The shark locks its sights on Shirley as she swims slowly towards Barry, Keith, and the family, blatantly unaware of the impending danger. In a scene straight out of a horror movie, the shark takes aim and breaches, powerfully launching Shirley several feet in the air, with her torso waist deep in its jaws. The beast lands on the water with a big splash, clamping its jaws down even harder to secure its grip on her body as it landed, crushing helpless Shirley's torso with its immense bite force, and begins viciously shaking its head from side to side, a technique which most sharks use to commonly rip limbs, thick blubber, and flesh off of their prey. The water around Shirley now turns blood red. The men and the kids, who at this point are frozen from shock, watched helplessly as the beast continued its rampage on poor Shirley. Barry suddenly snaps out of his frozen state and attempts to jump into the water to try to save his dying wife, but he was instantly held back by his friend Keith and the kids, as there was clearly nothing he could have done to save her. And as everyone was holding him back, Barry begins yelling hysterically, "She's gone, she's gone," as the men and the kids stood helplessly watching Shirley's torso floating in the water face down. To their shock and horror, they noticed that the shark had bitten her clean in half from the waist down. In a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie, the great white then suddenly returns, and in front of the eyes of her traumatized family, bites Shirley's head clean off of her body and swiftly turns towards the horizon and swims off into the ocean depths. The horror, however, does not end here. Various reports from the scene of the attack indicated that rescuers had attempted to retrieve what remained of Shirley from the water, but were never able to find her body. Despite days of intense search efforts to help salvage at least a piece of Shirley Ann for her family, there was no sign of her torso at the scene of the attack or around the vicinity whatsoever, and the search eventually had to be called off. It was later presumed that the great white had returned to Shirley's body for a third and final time to finish what remained of her once and for all, leaving Barry and the children with nothing but memories of the woman they all loved the most. Be sure to check out our last episode, featuring one of the most devastating bear attacks in North American history.